Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. This is Dylan Golby. First and foremost, I want to wish you all a happy new year. I hope that 2022 is getting off to a good start for you and yours. Now, in this week's video, I want to go back to a video that I did about a month ago on composition, where I talked about a few techniques that I try and employ just as a basic way to get started on composition. And so I thought for this video, we'd head out into the city and do a little street photography and try and apply those. As regular viewers to this channel will know, I typically live in that slightly wide out to short telephoto range. So in the Fujifilm X series, I really like to work with 16mm, 23mm, 33, 56, that sort of range. I don't really go into the ultra wide or the really long. And so this week I thought it would be fun to take out probably my least used lens, which is the 50 to 140mm f2.8. Now, I typically make use of this at corporate events and only at corporate events when I have, a speaker up on the podium and I need to make photographs of them from some sort of distance. I can't really get very close. The other times that I might use it might be on a couple session or, on a family session where I have a very specific idea in mind. But this lens really lives in my dry cabinet more than it does on my camera. Long lenses like this one allow you to get a little bit further back from your subject while still keeping them relatively large in the frame. And so with that distance comes a couple of things that you don't get with wider angle lenses. So if you're using 23 or 16mm or something like that, and you have to get quite close to your subject, you'll find that things like perspective distortion, so if you start to look up, lines start to converge, or things like that exaggeration of distance start to kick in. Whereas with a longer lens like this, it's the exact opposite. So you're going to be able to squeeze things together a little bit more by being further back. And you're also not going to run into that perspective distortion because you are further away from the things that you're shooting. And so for street photography, that was a really interesting dynamic to work with and resulted in some images that maybe I wouldn't normally have shot. So my initial idea for this video was to head downtown at lunchtime and sort of pick people out of the bustling crowds and see if I could make some interesting compositions with the buildings in the background and things like that. But what happened when I got down there was that I was a little bit thrown off by just how many people there were, and the light wasn't really working for me. And so what I ended up doing was actually making just a couple of abstracts of the buildings there and then deciding to switch up my location. And I thought, well, I've used the DDP for a previous video where I was looking at sort of light and shadow and how to compose around that. And so I thought, well, why not try that with basically the polar opposite lens? So with it being only a short bus ride away, I headed over there. And to be honest, when I arrived, I was still struggling. I stood at the crossing, looking at the building, thinking, I'm not sure if I can actually make something with a lens this long. So I did just that. I pulled it to my eye and I started trying to visualize scenes. When you're used to working with, say, 23, 35 or 50mm, to be able to visualize images at 140mm takes a very different way of looking at the world. And so I stood at the crossing and I picked out a frame of the building with a tree in the foreground and somebody walking through. Now, not the most exciting frame, but what it did get me thinking about was how to bring layers together using this lens. I still needed quite a bit of time to get used to visualizing with this lens, so as I crossed the road, I stopped at the top of the ramp that would normally take me down into the building and the patches of light that I photographed last time, and I just sort of took a look around through the lens again, zoomed all the way in and said, okay, which part of this can I simplify? And so I came across this scene, which is, it's pretty obvious, but basically there's a big curve of the building that goes like this, and then there's a bridge that comes out from underneath it. But normally I wouldn't even photograph this scene because you've got this sort of gap in between those two where the buildings in the background get too bright or too busy. And so I thought, okay, well, with this lens, I'm able to crop that out. So I made a couple of images just zooming all the way in and starting to simplify that scene. Heading down to the area that I shot in my previous video from this location, I began searching for ways to make use of the light. As you can see here, there's light on the floor, there's light on the walls, there's light being reflected onto the pillars, and it's a little bit different from the summer light that I worked in last time, which had these sort of really defined and large patches of light on the floor. Also, I didn't have the ability to go wide and make use of the shapes in that light and shadow this time, so I had to think a little bit differently. So while last time I was there, I was able to get in quite close to that light, raise the camera up, look down at it, and sort of get the length of the shadows and make some interesting images that way. With the longer lens, that just isn't possible. So I had to step back a little bit, and My first feeble attempts didn't really work out that well. You can see in this shot, I've still got that splash of light on the floor that kind of doesn't really work, and the overlapping pillars don't really create any interesting shapes or anything like that. So what I decided to do was just move around left and right, change my position, try and arrange those pillars into something interesting. And I also realized that with this longer lens, it's very easy for me to crop out the floor. So I didn't need to have that patch of light on the floor to deal with. So what I came up with was this frame. While I feel like I did a pretty good job of simplifying the scene and creating something a bit different, I've still got some scaffolding down in the bottom right-hand corner that I couldn't really get rid of by moving my body. So, I mean, it's a simple clone job if it really annoys me, but honestly, I don't mind it being there as it's quite dark and doesn't really draw you away from what you're supposed to be looking at, which is the crossing beams and the light, or the man in the light. Working in this same way, just sort of moving left and right and up and down, I was able to arrange the pillars into almost sort of a lozenge shape and find another place that I could put a character walking through. Now, as you can see here, if I raise the camera just a little bit, again, I have that splash of light on the floor, so I wasn't able to, get somebody's legs as they walked through, but I could definitely create an interesting shape. And what I really like is the way the light is reflecting on some of the pillars and not on the others. However, the best thing about that composition actually was that it led me to my next composition. So noticing that light was hitting the floor, bouncing back up onto the pillars, I decided to focus on just that for an image. So I moved back and I found the brightest one of those pillars, and around it, what I had was, on the left, I had a little sign that was sort of really, really bright and was going to be a bit of a distraction, and on the right, I had some direct sunlight hitting the wall. And so being able to step back and zoom in allowed me to get rid of both of those things. One of them was covered up, the sign was covered up by the pillar on the left, and then I was able to crop out the light on the right by just zooming in. And so then just basically waiting for a character to walk through my scene so that I could give it a little bit of interest. And having the zoom lens also allowed me to then quickly change up that composition and make a few options of that same scene. So by zooming out, I'm able to then include a little bit more of the pillars on the left-hand side and create a bit more of a geometric composition. But also by going horizontal, I'm able to include a lot more of those pillars on the left and have a few more sort of interesting shapes, as well as the play of that cool reflected light on the left-hand side of the frame with that sort of warmer reflected light and the white sunlight on the right-hand side of the frame. And again, just waiting for somebody to walk through and give a little bit of interest to the frame. So taking the 50 to 140 out for street photography really shook up the way that I typically work. Usually I'm able to sort of go up and down and around and be able to really change up my composition, but small movements like a step to the left and a step to the right with this lens don't make a huge difference because you're so far away from the things that you're photographing. Whereas, if you're up close with a wide angle lens, a couple of millimeters to the right or left really makes a huge difference. It really doesn't with this. So that was a little bit difficult in the beginning, but it also gave me the ability to do something that I don't normally do, which is easily, cut out sky and cut out, light on the floor and things like that, which allowed me to create some compositions that I normally wouldn't be able to do with the lenses that I typically work with. Still, the principles that I talked about in my previous composition video apply with this lens as they do with all lenses. So trying to simplify that scene and force your viewer to look at a certain subject by removing distractions are useful no matter what lens, no matter what equipment you're working with. It's just a different way of approaching the scene. So I hope that it's been interesting for you guys to hear my thoughts about what it was like to work with this lens versus some of the other lenses that I typically use. And I hope that you've enjoyed the video. So thanks again for watching, and we'll see you guys in the next one.